you doing, guys? Today I am continuing my efforts to putting this 1960 wheel horse Suburban 3-piece transmission back together. As I indicated in my last video, I was going to run the parts through my parts washer and starting to sand down the shafts or shoe shine the sand the shafts down, so that way they're all nice and clean. It's kind of funny because sometimes when I run things through my parts washer, I feel as if they come out dirtier than they really are. I mean, the fluid in that thing hasn't been changed probably in literally 20 years. I just add a little diesel to it every once in a while just to fill it back up. So the crud that's at the bottom of that can is got to be at least 1.5 inches thick, but that's for another day. As you can see, I did start sanding these shafts down to clean them all up. Input, cluster gear shaft. These are two of the pinion gear shafts. And basically this is what I'm starting off with, just lightly marked up, and then after just sanding them lightly, they come out fairly clean. So that way I know I have a nice clean surface when I'm putting that all together. So I'll be doing this. I got the reverse gear. I only have a couple more, and then I'm going to do the top of this. Next, I'll spray everything down with some brake cleaner, especially the rear differential. I'm going to press the bushings that I have or have been given into that, and we can at least get the differential back together. All right, let me get to cleaning. Just to give you a visual of what I'm doing here is, all these shafts have been, these are brand new, by the way, these axles. The customer that I'm doing this for said that it was okay to put 2 new axles in it. So, I sanded those all down. This slide shaft has been sanded. All the pinion and the reverse pin, they've all been sanded. The cluster gear's done. The brake shaft and the input shaft. Also, when you're doing these transmissions, you'll find that the gears in some of them are, let me get my hand out of the way so it'll focus for you. You'll see that the gears are usually rusted or a little bit pitted. Now you can go in there with a file and just gently file those teeth down just to get some of that rust off, but really the best way to do it is just get a piece of 220 sandpaper and sand each and every single little tooth on the gear. I sand the sides of it, gets it nice and clean, and the reason for that is by getting rid of those little burrs of rust, it just allows the transmission to work smoother. Now, I'm not going to do it to every single, like this one probably needs it. Yeah, I'll probably have to sand this entire gear down. This is the 3rd gear, 2nd gear. That one's going to need to be sanded. This one here probably doesn't need to be, because that's just a stator gear, or a gear that I call like a stator. It stays put, and it really just puts, it drives the input. It's not that big of a deal. There's nothing that slides in and out. This is a standard gear that just meshes with the standard gear. Same with this one. And you can tell by the corners of the gears if they actually slide and mesh. Like, see how that's kind of rounded over? That's the reverse gear. That's where this slide gear, the first and reverse slide gear, slides or engages into the reverse. And you can see it has a set of matching teeth that are ground on this. So, those gears really need to be sanded. This is a axle gear. It just runs with the pinion gears. There's no slide actuation. There's just, face-to-face contact. And all of these are in pretty good shape, so they just need to be cleaned. But any of the slide style gears, you're definitely going to want to clean them up. This one is a stationary gear. This one doesn't slide, but it's in pretty rough shape, so I'm going to smooth it up. That way the customer doesn't have any material issues with it. I want the transmission to work as good as it possibly can. I want it to work smooth. And as always, you never want to return. So I'm going to continue sanding all these gears down and all the teeth, and then we'll move on to welding up the side cover, because the side cover has a little chunk taken out of it. So we'll weld that up, and we'll take a look at that in just a second. So I welded a little piece of band iron into the notch. Basically, there was a pie cut taken out of the side of the cover. Just welded it in, ground it down. This is the outside. I hit the top edge with a file. The back edge is in good shape. There's a little bit of a weld pit here, but this is on the back. You won't see it. Once this is painted, you probably would never even know that it's been fixed. So I'm going to call that portion of this repair completed. Now, one thing that I need to show you is this. The differential on a RJ or a Suburban, they basically ride or rest on the ends of these axle tubes, just kind of like that. Now, there is a bronze bushing that is to be installed here, and we'll do that later on. But what happens with these transmissions is dirt, oil, eventually water gets leaked into these things if they've been sitting outside. And the ends of these tubes just get destroyed. And you can hear my nail go across these ridges. And this one's in pretty rough shape. But this has to be kind of rectified before you put a brand new bushing on it, because the weight of the tractor or somebody riding the tractor, these grooves are just going to tear right into the new bushing. So in order to kind of fix that, because really you can only kind of fix it, is where the grooves are, I take a fine file like this, and I just, file those grooves down. Ultimately, I'll take a piece of sandpaper, and then I'll kind of shoe shine that smooth so I can get as smooth of a finish as I can. Now, when I run my finger across this, you can't hear it. The grooves are basically, there's a little bit of grooves right here, but basically I'd say 95% of the grooves are gone. Now, one thing to keep in mind is obviously when you, oops, sorry, I'm looking for the bushing. What did I do with the bushing? Oh, here it is, sorry. Obviously when you file this tube down, you're basically opening up the clearance on the bushing. But if you don't go too crazy, you can slide the bushing on, and there is just a little bit of play in there. And I think it's enough play where you will get oil in there. This thing will stay lubricated. These grooves are gone, so they're not going to be digging into the bushing as the tractor's rotating. And unless you replace this tube specifically, there's really not a whole heck of a lot you can do. You just gotta have to kind of make do with what you got. So this is more than acceptable in my opinion. I'll do this side. I started cleaning out the bearing races or the bearing retainer areas. I'm gonna get all that done. I'm gonna cookie wheel. That's why I got this guy. I'm going to cookie wheel around where the gaskets go. I already did one side of the case. It's all cleaned and ready to go. I'll do the other side of the case. I'll blow this all off, and we're almost to the point of reassembly. All right, so let me get these few things done, and I'll be right back. Just before I go ahead and start filing this down to smooth it up, I just thought I'd bring up one thing. If you notice in this particular, might be hard with the camera, but this particular tube, there is a fairly good burr. And what that's from is obviously the wear of the differential spinning on the thing, on the tube end here. It actually wore a burr right here, and there's actually a burr on the edges. So not only am I going to file this smooth and sand it smooth, I'm also going to remove this burr and smooth out this entire edge. So that way when we put the differential on there, it gives that bearing, that bushing I should say, a fighting chance. Now that I have the side covers filed, sanded, and then ultimately preliminarily cleaned, so we can start installing the bearings and the bushings, before I start doing that to the side covers, I want to install the bushings into the carrier itself. Now, typically the bushings that you'll buy are readily available. Obviously, they're bronze in nature, and they are 1.5 inch outer diameter, 1 3/8 inner diameter, and they come about 1 3/4 inches in length. That's like the standard sizing. This bushing in itself will not work in an RJ or a Suburban differential. And let me show you why. there are two of these gears. These are the axle gears, and I'll show you how this all gets assembled probably in another video. But for this particular purpose, we're going to slide this gear into the differential. Now, please bear with my hairy wrist as I try to do this. Okay, they slide in like that. So in other words, the shank part of the gear slides into the differential, I guess, tube part. Okay, and if we measure, and I already measured this, basically the face of the gear right there to the outer edge of the differential. Okay, we go like this. I'm hoping we really can't see it, but trust me, it is just a hair over 1 3/8 inches. So clearly, this bushing is way too thick or way too long, whichever way you want to call it. If I went ahead and pressed this into the differential, okay, it would protrude way too deep into the carrier itself, where the axle gear would be protruded in this fashion, and ultimately the differential would bind up. So what we're going to have to do is we're actually going to have to cut these bushings down, or take a small portion off of them in order to make them fit all together with the axle gears. Now, if we can get this to show, it's just a hair over 1 3/8 inches. I like to give these a little bit of leeway, so I'm going to cut it just a hair shorter than 1 3/8 inches, both of these bushings. And that will give me just a little bit of play, or a little bit of clearance between the bushing edge and the face of the axle gear. That will also take into account for any, like, small amount of wear within the transmission itself. So this thing can kind of move around and slide around. These bushings, which are pressed in, can kind of slide around a little bit on the axle tubes. And it shouldn't interfere or bind up with the axle gears or the pinion gears. So let me go ahead and measure these up officially. I'll show you how I'm going to go ahead and cut it, and I'll be right back. So using my square, I set the measurement that I wanted, which is about 1 3/8 inches. Made a pencil mark, wrapped a piece of tape around, trying to eyeball. I eyeballed it, it's close enough. The edge of the tape parallel with the edge of the bushing. I'm going to take the bushing, put it in the vise. Obviously, I'll put something to protect the jaws. And I'm going to cut it with my hacksaw. Now, I'm not going to cut it with my hacksaw, like saw through it like this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start cutting it and then kind of rotate the bushing, cut a little bit, rotate the bushing, cut a little bit, rotate the bushing, cut a little bit. And the reason why I'm going to do that is so that way I don't end up with like a angled pie cut in either direction on the bushing. It kind of gives me a smoother, straighter edge. I could just lightly file it with a fine file, and that bushing will be just about ready to be installed. So let me set it up, start cutting it, and I'll show you how the cutting process goes. After running the hacksaw around the edge, obviously I pulled the tape off. I just gave the inside of the bushing right here a little file just to get rid of any burrs. I hit the top side of the bushing with the fine file just to smooth it out, and then just finished it up with a little bit of sandpaper. But as you can tell, it's a little shorter. The edge is nice and smooth. It is about as straight as you're going to be able to get it freehand, and it's ready to be installed. This particular bushing is ready to be installed in the differential, which we'll do next. I'm going to just cut and file and shape this one down to the same size as that, and then we'll get this thing over on the press, and we'll press these two bushings in. Differential up here on the press. Basically, I'm going to take one of the bushings that I cut down and filed all the edges, made sure everything's nice and smooth. I'm going to put a little WD-40 just on the outside of this, nothing too crazy. Make sure it's good and straight. I'll put a little piece of steel between the actual press arm and the bushing, and I'm just going to go ahead and set it right in there, push it right in, and everything should go okay. So let me get that done, and we'll take a look at the finished product. So after using the socket, I was able to push the bushing just below the face of the differential. There's actually a little bevel here which helps get that bushing to start and seat itself. So it's just below the bevel of the original bevel of the differential, and as you can see, there's just a hair of space between the axle gear and that bushing. Whoopsie daisy, there goes the axle gear. Let me see if I can get this thing to go back in so you can see that. So there we go. So now you can see there's just a little bit of space between the axle gear and the bushing. And if we flip it over and we take a look, the axle gear is completely flush to the side of the differential. All right, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to install the bushings in the axle tubes. The new axle bushings up here on the workbench. The size of this is 1 1/8 outer, 1 inch inner, 1.5 inches in length. This is a pretty typical bronze oil light bushing that you can get at McMaster Car. You can even buy them on eBay, fairly cheap. They're not that expensive. Now they get pressed into the end of the axle tube right here. Okay, but these are actually machined typically about 1.75 inches, and you can, oh, there it is. You can just see the edge, if I move my finger in there, of where they machined this tube to exactly 1 1/8 inner diameter. So with that, we don't have to cut these bushings down. We can go right to the press and, make sure everything's clean, lubricate them, and then go right to the press and press those in. I'm going to press them in exactly the same way as I did the differential. So I'm just going to go ahead and install these, and then we'll move on to the next step. The axle bushings are installed, just like the differential. I pressed them in just enough so the little bevel that's in the axle tube shows. That also will give a little bit of relief for the axle it's not the bushing, sorry, seal that goes on. It gives it a little room for the lip to ride the axle in a better fashion. One thing to keep in mind, sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes when you press these bushings into these axle tubes, the bushing will actually tighten up a little bit because it's kind of being squeezed into the tube. If that is the case, you're going to need to use a brake hone. So it's always best to first test fit your axles in both of the bushings. That way, number one, it's not too tight. It should be just loose enough where you can spin it with your fingers. Let me change my hand so you can see that, without much force. This is dry, so this is perfect. If it is too tight, what you're going to need to do, or what I do, I should say, is I'll grab my brake hone. I actually pulled it out just because I thought I need it, but I'm not. Put it in your drill with a little WD-40. You just kind of go in and out with the brake hone. That'll open up that bushing a little bit, and then you can get the axle in and out fairly smoothly. Just keep honing it until it fits, and it fits with just a little bit of drag, and you should be all set. Next thing I'm going to do is clean up this ridiculous mess I got on my workbench, and then we're going to start talking about installing the bearings. When it comes to bearings, you have basically 7 bearings that need to go into the transmission. You have 4 R12 bearings, and then you have 2 R12 unground bearings. And these bearings have a little bit of play, theoretically, in them. And the reason for that is the RJ Suburban transmission is not pinned. Not like a 3-speed or an 8-speed. They have the big dowel pins. So when you put it together, it all theoretically lines up. And then when you tighten it down, obviously there's no way for the cases to spin, so to speak. When it comes to a Suburban or an RJ transmission, there's no pins. It's just bolted together into the center section. So that's the reason for these 2 bearings being installed in the lower section, okay? Because it gives that cluster gear shaft a little bit of play theoretically. All the R12s, there's 2. This is the, if you're sitting on the tractor, this is the side that's on the right hand side, and this is the input side. So in other words, the input shaft goes right there. There are 2 R12 bearings. There's one on this side of the tube, and then there's one on this side of the tube. This one can just be pressed in and installed flush. You know, you can flush it or just a little bit inside. Again, I like to do it just a little bit inside where that bevel is, just inside the bevel. On the outside, okay, we have to press it almost, if not all the way to that ridge that you see inside there. And the reason for that is this: there is a grease seal or an oil seal that also has to be pressed on the outside of the input area. And actually that seal, let me get it, is right here. So basically we have to install this seal. And it is about, you know, probably about 1/4 of an inch, just a touch thinner than 1/4 of an inch, and that's eventually going to have to be pressed in that position. So that's the only kind of, like, I'm not even going to say tricky, but the thing that we just have to be mindful. The outboard R12 bearing goes in here, but we do have to press it in far enough to give enough room to press the seal on. Now, essentially, these go in exactly how I did the bushings. Just going to put it up here on the Dake press and gently press them all in. When I do the inside ones, again, I'm not going to go and bury the bearing all the way to the back side. I'm going to put it in and I'm going to press it in just inside the bevels. So that way there's just maybe just a hair of space behind the bearing itself from the side cover, or side plate. One thing I'm going to do for this transmission before I go and install the bearings is where the prior owner or the owner of the transmission took out the old bearings. They kind of dinged up the back sides. There's a pretty good burr right here. So I'm going to clean that up with my Dremel and a little sanding tool just to make sure that I'm not going to have any issues with the press, because once you put these bearings in, man, they are a major pain in the back end to get out. So with that being said, let me go ahead and clean these up and press those bearings in. The last bearing we need to install is this one right here, which is a Torrington B103 before the camera went wild on us. And it goes right in here in the input shaft. Ultimately, the slide gear shaft will slide into this bearing. So I got it here up on the press. I'm going to gently press it in, obviously straight. Don't want to start it in that fashion, but get that pressed in. And then all the bearings have been installed. I just want to maybe correct myself in one thing. I did indicate, I think earlier in the video, that these unground bearings are supposed to go in the lower positions. That was incorrect of me. Essentially, one has to go on the left side of the case. This would be the brake shaft side, okay? And one has to go in the upper. This is the input side. The input shaft goes here, and in the upper retaining ring. And the reason for that is this: the input shaft, okay, goes from this bearing to these two bearings, but it has the Torrington bearing of the input shaft to create a little bit of slop in the slide gear shaft. The lower cluster gear, okay, has it in this side, and this provides a little bit of slop in the cluster gear shaft. The brake shaft exits on this side. It has to have a regular R12 for the seal. And on the opposing side, there is an unground R12 bearing, and that allows that shaft just a little bit of play. So when we fit it all together, it'll all you can kind of, you know, situate and slide the two case halves in order for those, number one, those shafts to line up and slide into the bearings, and two, keep the transmission from binding up, because again, this is not pinned, it's just bolted together. All right, guys, with that, I think the rough preparation for assembly has been completed. The bearings are all installed. We have the axle bushings in place, test fitted the axles in them to make sure that they work. We also cut down and installed the bushings in the differential. Both sides, that's all set to go. We don't have to hone these out because the tubes on the tubes themselves on the side covers here, okay, they, as we indicated earlier, needed to be filed down and smoothed out so that they don't chew up the new bushings, which means they are already sized down a touch. So we're not going to have any issue with that. All right, That was a lot. Next video, which will be the assembly of this transmission, will be coming up shortly. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for all your support, nice comments. Please like, share, and subscribe this to my channel, and to share the video if you would, please. Please hit the like button so that way I can get notifications that the videos are doing well, and also to allow other people to see it. All right. Till the next video, thank you very much and have a great day.